Had she known that stagecoaches were this fucking boring, she would have begged the enforcers to let her stay, or at least let her try to find passage on a coast hopper. But then again, it did take the entire prestige behind the Blackthorn name to stop them from hanging her over the smouldering ruins. So a miserably monotonous journey with a bunch of strangers was definitely better than a rope around her neck. Though after the past few hours of staring at the distant ocean, she had her doubts. At least the rope would have been quick. The stagecoach hit a ditch alongside the country road, jostling Kira and the other passengers into one another. Seizing the opportunity, she forced out a giggle in the ensuing silence, trying to lock eyes with anyone, but they all seemed undisturbed by the momentary break in the harrowing boredom. Each of the other passengers was too preoccupied in whatever they were doing, and Kira was just about at wit's end, staving off the discomfort that rides boredom. A stout older man sat diagonally from her wearing half-moon glasses, just like the ones Mr. Blackthorn wore, but with a much more crooked nose buried deep between the flaps of a weathered book that had not lifted once since she saw him at the stage station back in town. The man had been so engrossed in the book, she was unsure if he had even noticed the group of armed enforcers that saw her onto the carriage. While Kira White knuckled her way through the past few hours of boredom, the silver-haired man's eyes remained steadfastly downwards. Books never interested Kira, much to Mr. Blackthorn's dismay. She refused to sit still long enough to need one. Kira leaned forward and nudged the older man's knee delicately.
Hi, sorry, but what are you reading?
The man did not immediately stir, so Kira nudged him a little harder once more.
Apologies. Did you have an inquiry?
Ooh, yes. Hi, sorry. I am just wondering what you are reading.
He looked her over, as if perplexed by her existence. Probably realizing that he was not alone on the stagecoach, Kira thought. Yet, despite her insistence, his icy blue eyes held no sharpness. Curiosity, certainly, but also kindness. That was all the invitation Kira needed.
I don't know nothing about books, but Mr. Blackthorn always said books are magical. I don't know what he meant, never did, but is there any magic in your book?
The man pursed his lips as if he was enjoying a sour candy and lifted the unmarked cover slightly.
I must agree with this, Mr. Blackthorn. Books are quite wonderful things. Take, for example, this one.
The older man lifted the thick book with both hands, as if it were a newborn.
This book is spectacularly informational. It holds between its covers the entire known history of our destination's coastline, a complete survey of the seasonal temperatures, a fantastic summary and accompanying illustration of the low-tide fog, and even a section on the wildlife.
Kira could not stop her smile from falling. Books were much worse than she feared.
Ooh, that is, magical?
The older man chuckled heartily, as if she had just told him a shared joke. The priestess next to Kira did not stir at the noise, her eyes remaining shut in meditation, but the gigantic warrior across from Kira momentarily opened his eyes.
A pebble might break the tranquility of a pond, causing ripples across its surface, but a pond is not bound to the whims of a pebble.
The priestess's voice floated on the stagnant cabin air, and the imposing warrior immediately forced his eyes shut, wrinkles forming at his temples from the intensity. Clearing his throat, the old man adjusted his glasses and turned his shoulders slightly away from Kira as he returned to his boring book, allowing the dreaded silence to waft right back in. Kira sighed, plopping her head into her hands, resigning herself to more time with the window and the unchanging ocean. She watched the ocean stay being an empty ocean until, despite her best efforts, sleep finally found her. As she opened her eyes, she saw the Blackthorn estate was still intact, and Kira was sitting at the formal dining hall table in the west wing, as was Mr. Blackthorn. He was smiling, and was flanked by Akira and Kasmina, their dutiful maids. They were all far from Kara, at the opposite end of the banquet table. Everyone seemed to be in great spirits, just like the early days. Kira could not hear their lively conversation, as the table seemed to stretch further and further away, but even at her great distance, she saw what had been lost after the latest incident. Joy. Love. Kira stood to join them, but as she did, they all stopped laughing in unison, their merriment evaporating the instant her chair scraped along the floor. Kira froze under their collective stare. Akira and Kasmina's glare felt like an enforcer's jacket on her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. And Mr. Blackthorn's disappointment felt like a hot knife, straight through her heart. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat as smoke filled her nostrils. Her eyes widened as her heart hammered into her ribcage. She lost control of her limbs as her arms convulsed, and the uninvited green flames roared to life, engulfing her trembling hands. Just like all the other times, she watches as the horrid flames spread. Jade droplets of cold fire splatter onto the banquet table, the inferno greedily latching onto the ancient wood as it sprints down the table towards Mr. Blackthorn. She tries to warn them, but a lineous groan drowns out her tearful cry, followed by the sound of her temple slamming into the side of the small carriage cabin. The impact yanks her out of the land of dreams and back into the cramped stagecoach. Kira rubs the growing goose egg, stifles a groan, but is grateful the nightmarish memory ended when it did. She had hoped it would have stayed with the rest of the burnt rubble back in town, but that had never been her kind of luck. The cabin lurched violently again, finally catching the attention of her fellow passengers and forcing everyone to brace themselves so as to not tumble over one another. The stagecoach lurches once more before finding its balance. The older man brushes strands of his silver hair back into place, while the priestess lets out a long sigh and slowly closes her eyes again. But the Goliath sitting directly across from Kira nervously casts glances at the priestess, with a hand nervously pulling at his shirt. She wanted to ask if he was all right, but before she could form the words, the giant man let out a tremendous belch fitting to his size.
Apologies, but gonna have to blame that one on the stagecoach. And honestly, it was needed.
Kira shot upright in her seat, forgetting her throbbing temple at the possibility of an entertaining distraction. The priestess also took notice, opening one glaring eye towards the giant man, though the rest of her face held no emotion. The silver-haired man spared Kira a knowing look before raising his boring book up to cover his face. The huge man clearly wanted to say something more, but under the priestess's eye silence strangled any further conversation. Kira knew that she had to do something quick, otherwise the suffocating boredom would surely return. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin towards the big man before her, and swallowed a deep breath. All heads turned towards Kira as she narrowed a challenging gaze at the warrior directly in front of her.
The name's Kira, and I was much louder.
The warrior crossed his arms and leaned back, eyeing the much smaller Kira before him as she eyed him back. The behemoth's face was covered in scars, and his light brown eyes were hardened from a long life, but Kira found a sparkle in his eye, a small one, just beneath the raised brow, a little bit of mischief. Kira knew how to fan that flame and pushed on.
I take it that you agree with me then?
The big man grinned, shaking his head.
Ha-ha! No, little one. Mine was much louder.
Kira smiled at the warrior before turning to the other two passengers. The old man tried to keep a smirk from reaching his face, but gave up when another slight chuckle escaped his best efforts. He glanced at the priestess, who shut her eye once more, returning to her meditation. Crossing one leg over the other and resigning the book to the bench, the old man addressed the cabin.
Well, Kira, it is an unexpected pleasure to meet you. My name is Reinar. I have traveled quite extensively around the world, and although I may not be a trained officiant in such matters, I believe your belch was superior to Braxus's belch. Corin, what say you?
Reinar addressed his question to the inscrutable priestess. Corin opened her eyes and turned her head ever so slightly to take in the Braxus, and just a smidge further to flicker her eyes over Kira. The priestess placed a thumb to her lips, her golden eyes falling to the floor of the carriage, and she did not respond. Taking a closer look at Corin, Kira noticed that beneath the flowing cream robes was a subtle set of armor with intricate patterns and a polished black stone center of the chestplate. Kira wanted to ask her the question again, but both Rhinar and the large man Braxus seemed to be in no hurry, so Kira kept her mouth shut. The priestess sat further into her seat, dropping her hands to a steepled position, and finally responded.
I have sworn an oath to hold the truth close to my heart. And although the Order finds beauty in bravely facing a challenge, a retaliation must be ever fiercer to subdue one's opponent. Both in war and life, retaliation must be greater than the first strike. Anything less is submission.
The rest of the cabin listened intently to Corin's words, as if she was discussing something far more serious than the volume of Kira's burp. Rhinar shared a wink with Kira before nodding towards Corin.
Wise words worthy of the Obsidian Way.
At the mention of her order, Corin dipped her head and steepled her fingers together. The larger man hastily followed her motions.
You are far too generous with your compliments, Magi. I only speak as a shard-bearer speaks, nothing more.
Kira had no clue what an obsidian way was, let alone which way it was going, but she hadn't survived this long by letting strangers know when she was lost. What Kira definitely knew was that the priestess was named Corin and was something important, or impressive, or maybe both. The big man was named Braxus and seemed to be traveling with the priestess, lovers perhaps. Though Kira shook her head slightly at the idea, Corin was far too pretty for Braxus. And finally, Kira knew Rhinar was a magi, which meant that he probably had some fancy robes and could do some entertaining tricks, just like all the other magi Kira had ever seen populating town squares. Pulling animals out of hats and using big words to entertain people for some coin. Kira always liked them, good sources for quick coins.
In time, Corin, in time. Now then, I believe we owe our contestants here a verdict. Assuming the two of you vote for yourselves, we are at an impasse. Corin?
Corin's eyes held Rhinar's for a moment, and to Kira's amazement, the edge of Corin's lip tilted slightly upwards in a tiny smirk.
Yes, Magi, indeed. Uncertainty is no harbor for truth. And in a world of absolutes, we must not rest until the universe is satisfied. A rematch will be required.
Both Braxus and Kira eagerly grunt in agreement. Braxus scoots to the edge of his seat, rolling his shoulders as if limbering up for battle. He focuses his gaze onto Kira. As Mr. Blackthorne always said, moments are meant to be acted on. Kira stands on her seat to level her gaze at the giant before her. She intertwines her fingers to crack all of her knuckles at once, staring directly into Braxus's hard, light brown eyes. The mischievous sparkle was blazing, and Kira had him and the rest of the cabin in the palm of her hands. Kira curled her fists and was just about to swallow a lungful of air when a series of wooden thunks rang out from the outside of the stagecoach. The coach driver screamed out in agony. The carriage lurched violently first in one direction, then the other, causing Kira to fly off her feet as the cabin rolled and crashed onto its side. The overturned stagecoach slid just for a moment, and then came to a rest.
My goodness, is everyone all right?
I am found to be unharmed.
No problems here. Where did the little one go?
It appears that you are sitting on top of her.
Light and oxygen returned to her world as the warrior rolled off of her. She gulped down air as she gave a shaky nod to Rhinar. She looked around the disorienting interior, bewildered.
What happened? Was there an accident?
I believe this to be purposeful rather than incidental.
Corin nodded towards Braxus before helping Rhinar to his feet.
Thank you kindly, Corin. Bandits, perhaps?
Braxus was already in motion. With a shove, he opened the cabin door directly above them, allowing the bright daylight to flood in. He grabbed the lip of the opening and pulled himself just enough to peek over the ledge, the giant man's toes still touching the floor. A few more thunks hit the outside of the carriage, sending wooden splinters into the cabin. The warrior ducked his head as 2 arrows whistled past the opening, just missing his bald head.
Shit. That was close.
Initiate, did you get a count?
No. They are covered by the tree line.
The priestess ran her fingers along the indented wall, plucking at the fractured wood. Rubbing the collected dust between her fingers, she murmured to herself as the grains drifted to the ground. She steepled her fingers once more and turned back to the group.
Fortune endeavors favors on those who dare boldly, and ever more favorably on those who act swiftly. It is not in our creed to embark in inaction.
If I had my sword, I could manage a few, but only if I can get stuck in with them. I doubt I could make it to them, though. They'd probably get me before I even got to my sword.
Accurate assessment, Initiate. Maggie, what can you provide?
Corin and Braxus turned toward Reinar, who was thumbing through his book. Kira could not help but gawk at the old man for trying to read while they were seemingly under attack.
I was asking myself the very same question. Ah, this will do.
Reinar stopped his page, turning, and sat cross-legged amid the chaos. A gnarled finger tracing the words on the page, Kira watched in amazement as the words began to wriggle and move with the passing of his hand. The letters began to escape the confines of the page and swirl together in the air, colliding and morphing into a wet cloud hovering just above the upturned book, using his other hand to cajole the thick fog in place. Both Corin and Braxus seemed fairly unfazed by the trick, while Kira's mouth hung open. This was nothing like the other entertainers in the market square at all.
Yes, this shall serve our purposes. Are we ready?
Corin and Braxus glanced at each other before nodding. Using both hands, Reinar grabs the tiny fog bank and slams it into the now blank page of the book. The book shudders under his palms as blue and white light seep out between his fingers. He groans a bit as he wrangles the book still, but the shaking intensifies until it becomes uncontrollable. Wet fog pours out of the shuddering book, billowing faster and faster, filling the interior of the cabin in an instant. Kira cannot see anything in the magical fog, only the glow of the shaking book as more fog pours into the cabin and out above their heads.
Get moving!
Reinar calls out to the others as the glow from the book begins to fade. Kira is able to finally see her hands and the shapes of the others as the magic fog continues to pour upwards out of the stagecoach opening. Needing no further encouragement, Braxus grabbed the opening once more and pulled himself out of the cabin with Corin right on his heels, the carriage creaking under their weight. Kira held her breath, waiting for a storm of arrows, but all she heard was the sound of her 2 allies landing on the ground just outside the cabin.
How did you do that?
Reinar got to his feet and flashed a smile at her, the blank book laid open at his feet.
I did very little. It was the researchers who did all the work. Their analysis of the Luminos Coast's summer fog turned out to be quite useful. Shame, though, I was really enjoying the book too.
Reinar closed the blank book and patted the cover gently, just as 2 knocks rang out from the cabin wall, catching his sorrowful gaze.
Looks like we best be going as well, shall we?
He gestured towards the opening with his gnarled fingers. Kira's eyes widened as she looked up at the fog. Just as she was about to protest, another wooden thunk hit the cabin. With enough force, the arrowhead spat wood at them. While the brief time she spent at the estate had certainly been the happiest days of her life, filled with many life lessons, Mr. Blackthorne never taught her anything about surviving an arrow attack. So she relied on what got her through life before those days. Always move and keep moving. She sprang up with the assistance of Reinar and pulled herself up into the thick fog before sliding headfirst down the side of the carriage, landing in a heap. Just as she was orienting herself, a pair of strong hands seized her. She was about to scream, but the priestess's hand clamped her mouth.
Silence is to our advantage. Do you understand?
Kira nodded her head as Rhinar slid down next to her, landing in a low crouch.
Stay by my side and I will protect you.
Corin released her grip on Kira's mouth as Braxus emerged from the fog with a small satchel that he quickly handed to Rhinar. Braxus tapped his chest with a closed fist and pointed with a single finger from the direction he just emerged. Corin shook her head, tapped her own chest, and pointed with 2 fingers in a different direction. Braxus nodded his assent and started off in that direction. Rhinar close on his heels. Kira started after them, but Corin held the back of her dress firm. The 2 men disappeared into the fog bank, their footsteps swallowed by the drifting wetness. After a moment, arrows whizzed around them, a few striking the carriage itself, a few scattering more rocks. As soon as silence returned, Corin pulled Kira tightly next to her and forced her into a low crouch as the 2 of them started to head out into the fog.